Won the night Hope left. Have you ever felt someone leave without actually walking out the door? If stories like this speak to the part of you that never says a word, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, because some truths are only heard in a whisper. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. No slammed doors. No raised voices. No dramatic goodbye. Adrian was still there, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. Sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms, scrolling through something on his phone. The lamp above them cast a soft amber glow, gentle and almost romantic. But something was missing. Elena felt it before she understood it. There are moments when the air changes, not in temperature, but in presence, and that night, the space between them felt wider than the room itself. She asked him how his day was. He answered. But not really. His words were correct, logical, clean, like someone filing a report instead of sharing a life. And when she reached for his hand, not dramatically, just lightly, his fingers stayed still. Not pulling away, but not reaching back. That was the moment. Hope didn't explode. It didn't shatter. It thinned, like fog dissolving under morning light. She tried again, a softer tone, a gentler smile, the version of herself that always made things easier. She told herself he was tired, that stress does strange things to people, that love sometimes goes quiet before it comes back louder. But something in her chest had already begun to close. He leaned back in his chair. She leaned forward. That subtle geometry of distance said more than any confession ever could. And in the quietest way possible, she understood. He wasn't leaving physically. He was leaving emotionally. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only happens beside someone you love. It doesn't scream, it hums, low and constant. That night, Elena lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling. Adrian's breathing was steady, almost peaceful. She wondered when she had started feeling like a guest in her own relationship. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she made a quiet promise to herself. Stay calm. Stay patient. Stay loving. Maybe if she stayed long enough, hope would come back. But deep down, in the part of her she rarely listened to, she already knew. Hope hadn't walked out. It had simply stopped trying. And she stayed. To the silence that replaced love. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like dust on furniture you stop noticing because it becomes part of the room. At first, it was small things. Adrian stopped asking follow-up questions. He would nod, say, "That's good," and let the conversation fall flat between them. Not unkind, not cruel, just distant. Elena began filling the gaps. She talked more, explained more, laughed a little louder than she needed to. Because silence, when you love someone, can feel like rejection. Dinner became procedural. How was work? Fine. Anything interesting? Not really. The words were there, the warmth wasn't. She started noticing how often he looked at his phone mid-sentence. How his eyes skimmed past her instead of resting on her. How he responded with logic when she needed feeling. When she said, "I miss you," he replied, "I'm right here." And technically, he was. But presence without connection feels like standing next to a locked door. The bed grew wider at night. Not physically. Emotionally. She would turn toward him, hoping his arm might instinctively wrap around her waist the way it used to. Instead, she felt the careful neutrality of his body, not rejecting her. But not reaching either. Neutrality can be colder than anger. Anger at least means something is alive. Silence feels like something has already died. Elena began editing herself. If she had a difficult day, she shortened the story. If she felt anxious, she told herself to handle it alone. If she needed reassurance, she swallowed it before it reached her tongue. Because every time she leaned in emotionally, she felt him lean back. It wasn't dramatic. That was the hardest part. There was no fight to point to. No betrayal to accuse. No scene to replay. Just the quiet erosion of intimacy. She started timing her vulnerability, choosing moments when he seemed least distracted. measuring his tone before speaking, studying his pauses like they contained answers. Love had once felt effortless between them. Now it felt negotiated. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being unheard, not because someone interrupts you, but because they never truly arrive in the conversation. She could feel herself becoming smaller. Not in personality. In expectation. She stopped asking, "What are you feeling?" Because the answer was always, "I'm fine." And fine became the wall she kept walking into. One night, she reached for his hand again, the same small gesture from weeks before. He let her hold it. But his thumb didn't move. That used to be his tell, that subtle brushing motion when he was fully there. This time, his hand was still. And she understood something quietly devastating. Love hadn't exploded. It had been replaced. Replaced by politeness. By routine. By careful coexistence. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of things unsaid. And she stayed. Free the first time she felt alone beside him. It didn't happen during a fight. It happened during something that should have felt safe. They were at a friend's small gathering, soft music. Low lights. The kind of evening where couples lean into each other without thinking. Laughter rose in warm waves around the room. Glasses clinked. Someone told a story too loudly. Elena stood beside Adrian, her hand lightly resting against his arm. He didn't pull away. But he didn't lean in either. At one point, someone asked them how they met. It was a simple question. A sweet one. The kind that usually makes couples smile at each other before answering. She looked at him instinctively. Waiting. He answered without looking back. Calm, brief, factual. She felt it then, a thin crack somewhere inside her. It wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't do. He didn't reach for her waist. He didn't glance at her with shared memory. He didn't soften. The story of them sounded like a resume. Not a love story. Later that night, she stepped outside for air. The cool evening wrapped around her shoulders, grounding her in a way the room hadn't. She stared at the streetlights, blinking against an emotion she couldn't quite name. Adrian joined her a few minutes later. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just needed air." He accepted that answer without question. That was new. There used to be a time when he would look closer, when he would tilt his head slightly and say, "No, tell me what's really going on." But this version of him simply stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the street instead of her face. She wanted to say, "I feel invisible." Instead, she said nothing. Because admitting loneliness while standing next to someone you love feels irrational. Almost embarrassing. How could she feel alone when he was right there? Yet the space between their shoulders felt heavier than the night air. Back inside, she watched him laugh with someone else, relaxed, animated, engaged. The contrast cut deeper than any argument could have. He still had warmth. It just didn't seem to reach her. That was the first time she questioned herself. Maybe she was asking for too much. Maybe she was overly sensitive. Maybe love simply changes after a while. She replayed the evening in her mind like evidence. No cruelty. No sharp words. No obvious neglect. Just the subtle absence of being chosen in small moments. When they drove home, the car was quiet. Not tense. Just muted. Streetlights slid across his face as he focused on the road. She studied his profile, searching for something familiar. Some flicker of the man who once looked at her like she was the only person in the room. He sensed her gaze. "What?" he asked gently. "Nothing," she replied. Because how do you explain a feeling that has no visible cause? That night, lying beside him, she felt the weight of something unnamed. She wasn't abandoned. Not officially. But she felt emotionally unaccompanied. And that distinction, that subtle, quiet difference, frightened her more than anger ever could. For the first time, she realized something devastating. You can be chosen once? And still feel unchosen later. And she lay there, inches from him, staring into the dark. Feeling alone beside the man she loved. 4. What emotional unavailability looks like. Emotional unavailability doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't slam doors or raise its voice. It looks reasonable. It sounds calm. It even feels safe at first. Adrian wasn't cruel. He didn't insult her. He didn't disappear for days. He showed up to dinners. He remembered birthdays. He paid attention to the details that make someone appear dependable. That was the confusing part. On paper, he was present. In reality, he was unreachable. When Elena tried to talk about feelings, he redirected the conversation to solutions. If she said, "I've been feeling anxious lately," he replied, "You just need better sleep." If she said, "I feel distant from you," he answered, "We're just busy. It's normal." Every emotion became something to fix, not something to sit with. She started noticing how he avoided eye contact during vulnerability, how his jaw tightened when conversations drifted too close to intimacy, how he used humor like a shield, changing the tone before it grew too serious. He wasn't rejecting her. He was sidestepping her. There's a subtle difference. Rejection hurts sharply. Avoidance hurts slowly. He never said, "Stop needing me." But he said, "I don't see why this is a big deal." He never said, "Your feelings are too much." But he said, "You're overthinking." And over time, she began shrinking her emotional vocabulary around him. She chose lighter words, safer topics, shorter confessions. Because vulnerability felt like knocking on a door that opened just enough to say, "Not now." Emotional unavailability doesn't always look like absence. Sometimes it looks like partial presence. Like someone standing close enough to touch, but never stepping inside your inner world. Adrian could talk for hours about work, about politics, about future plans. But when she asked, "What scares you?" he smiled faintly and said, "Nothing, really. No one is afraid of nothing." But he insisted he was. And she began realizing that loving someone emotionally unavailable feels like holding water in your hands. The closer you press, the more it slips through. There were nights she tried to create space for honesty. Soft lighting, phones away, gentle tone. "I just want to feel closer to you," she would say quietly. He would nod. "I know. But knowing isn't the same as opening." He didn't yell. He didn't leave. He didn't promise change either. He remained steady. Steady like a wall. And walls don't betray you. They just don't let you in. She started doubting her own sensitivity. Maybe she expected too much emotional depth. Maybe she was wired differently. Maybe some people just aren't expressive. But deep down, she understood something painful. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he didn't know how to go deeper. And emotional unavailability doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It shows up in the moments when you need connection most and receive composure instead. It's the difference between someone hearing your words and someone holding your fear. And she was learning, slowly, that she had been speaking to a man who listened, but rarely arrived. 5. The childhood echo. It took her years to understand that what felt familiar wasn't always safe. Adrian's distance didn't shock her the way it might have shocked someone else. It unsettled her, yes, but it didn't feel foreign. It felt known. And that realization scared her more than his silence ever could. Because somewhere deep inside, Elena had learned early on that love required patience. That closeness had to be earned. That affection wasn't something you received freely, it was something you waited for. Her father had been a quiet man. Not unkind, not cruel, just emotionally reserved. He worked long hours. He provided stability. He kept promises. But feelings were rarely spoken in their home. Comfort came in practical forms, not tender ones. If she cried, he would say, "You're strong. You'll be okay." If she needed reassurance, he would offer advice instead of presence. And as a little girl, she interpreted that as love. Because children don't question the blueprint they're given. They adapt to it. She became the easy daughter, the understanding one, the child who didn't ask for too much. She learned how to read moods, how to sense when someone was tired or preoccupied, how to minimize herself to keep harmony intact. And without realizing it, she carried that skill into adulthood. So when Adrian withdrew emotionally, something in her didn't scream, "Leave." It whispered, "Try harder." When he avoided vulnerability, she didn't interpret it as incompatibility. She interpreted it as familiarity. His emotional reserve mirrored something she had spent her childhood trying to win over. And winning love from someone distant feels intoxicating, because it feels like proof. Proof that you were patient enough, soft enough, good enough. She didn't fall for Adrian's silence. She recognized it. There's a quiet tragedy in that. The heart often feels safest in patterns it already knows, even when those patterns hurt. Elena wasn't chasing neglect. She was chasing completion. Somewhere in her mind, loving Adrian successfully meant healing an old story. If she could get him to open up, if she could make him choose vulnerability, if she could be the one he trusted most, then maybe that younger version of herself, the girl waiting at the edge of her father's attention, would finally feel chosen. But Adrian wasn't her father. And she wasn't a child anymore. Yet the emotional reflex remained the same. Stay calm. Don't overwhelm. Be understanding. Hope will come if you are steady enough. She realized, slowly, that she wasn't just staying for him. She was staying for the unfinished longing of a younger self. And that's the part that made leaving feel impossible. Because walking away from Adrian didn't just mean losing him. It meant confronting the old echo she had never healed. It meant accepting that some doors were never meant to open, no matter how gently you knock. And that truth lingered inside her, heavy and undeniable. Sometimes the person you're trying to save isn't the one in front of you. It's the child you used to be. 6. Why she mistook distance for strength. For a long time, Elena didn't call it distance. She called it composure. She admired the way Adrian could walk into a room and never ask for approval. The way he didn't chase attention. The way he stayed calm when other people fell apart. He seemed solid. In a world full of loud emotions and constant oversharing, his restraint looked like maturity. And Elena had spent most of her life craving maturity. She had dated men who were expressive but unstable, men who said, "I love you," like a mood, not a decision. Men who flooded her with affection and then disappeared the moment life got complicated. So when she met Adrian, his steadiness felt like relief. He didn't text in bursts. He didn't panic. He didn't plead. He didn't need her to regulate him. At least, that's what she told herself. At first, his silence felt like protection. When she was anxious, he stayed calm. When she overthought, he stayed logical. When she cried, he didn't break down, he just stayed. And that looked like strength. But the more she leaned on that strength, the more she realized it came with a cost. He stayed calm, even when she needed comfort. He stayed logical, even when she needed softness. He stayed steady, even when the relationship was cracking. Elena began confusing emotional absence with emotional control. She thought, he doesn't get worked up, so he must be wise. He doesn't react, so he must be grounded. He doesn't need reassurance, so he must be secure. But security doesn't shut you out. Real strength doesn't make you feel alone. Over time, she noticed the pattern beneath his composure. His calm wasn't always peace. Sometimes it was avoidance. Sometimes it was a refusal to enter any space where feelings might be messy and uncontrollable. If she brought up something tender, he changed the subject. If she asked for closeness, he gave her a plan. If she needed reassurance, he reminded her of facts. He was excellent at managing life. He was less willing to share it. And Elena, without meaning to, started performing emotional neatness for him. She brought him problems only when she had already wrapped them in solutions. She spoke in calm sentences. Even when her chest was screaming, she tried to become easy to love. Because she thought love was earned by not needing too much. And in her mind, Adrian's distance became something noble. Like a man who had mastered himself. Like a man above drama. like a man too strong to be shaken. But one night, she caught herself doing something that stopped her cold. She was rehearsing her feelings in her head, cutting out anything that sounded needy, softening anything that sounded like longing, before she dared say it out loud. As if love required perfect wording. As if her heart had to be edited to be acceptable. And that was the moment she understood. This wasn't strength. This was restraint without intimacy. This was composure without connection. Because the strongest people don't just stay calm. They stay present. They don't use distance as dignity. They use honesty as courage. Elena realized she had mistaken Adrian's closed door for a fortress. And she had called it safety, when it was simply sealed. 7. Becoming smaller. It didn't start with her changing her personality. It started with her changing her volume. Elena used to speak the moment something touched her, something sweet, something sharp, something confusing. She used to reach for honesty the way other people reached for coffee in the morning, without overthinking it. But slowly, she began pausing. Not because she had nothing to say. Because she started calculating what her feelings would cost. If she talked about her day, would he listen, or would he glance at his phone? If she admitted she missed him, would he soften, or would he respond with a neutral, "I'm here"? If she asked for reassurance, would he hold her, or would he explain why she didn't need it? So she edited. And the editing became a habit. She stopped telling him the full story when she felt overwhelmed. She summarized her sadness into something manageable. She turned her anxiety into jokes so it wouldn't sound heavy. Not because she wanted to lie. Because she wanted to stay. There's a particular survival skill some people develop in love. You learn how to make your needs small enough to fit inside someone else's limitations. Elena became fluent in that language. She learned how to wait for the right time. She learned how to ask softly, like a request that could be denied without guilt. She learned how to accept crumbs with gratitude because asking for a meal felt like too much. And the scariest part? She didn't notice the moment it became normal. It's subtle, how the heart compromises. It tells itself. He's stressed. He's busy. He's not like you. This is just a season. And seasons pass, right? But the season didn't pass. It settled. She started keeping a quiet list in her mind, things she wouldn't bring up. Don't mention that you felt lonely at the party. Don't ask why he's distant this week. Don't say, "I need you," unless you can say it like a joke. She didn't want conflict. But deeper than that, she didn't want proof. Proof that if she asked for more, he would give less. So she made herself easier to love. She became the woman who didn't ask too many questions. The woman who didn't cry at the wrong time. The woman who waited until she was alone to fall apart. She started doing emotional housekeeping, cleaning up her feelings before he could see them. Because if he saw the mess, he might leave. Or worse, he might stay and still not care. That was the fear that lived under everything. Not abandonment through absence, but abandonment through indifference. One night she caught herself saying, "It's fine," before she even knew what she was feeling. And she realized she had become two people. The woman she was when she was alone, raw, honest, aching. And the woman she was with him, careful, composed, small. She wasn't shrinking because she lacked confidence. She was shrinking because she was trying to preserve love. But love shouldn't require you to disappear. And that's what hurt the most. She wasn't just losing him. She was losing herself. Quietly. Patiently. One smaller sentence at a time. 8. Loving for 2. At some point, Elena stopped asking herself, "Is he tired?" And started asking, "How do I keep this alive?" That's what loving for 2 feels like. You become the engine and the fuel. You plan the warmth. You initiate the closeness. You carry the emotional weather so the house doesn't feel cold. She began doing little things, quiet, strategic things, hoping they would wake something in him. She'd cook his favorite meal on a random night, like a soft reminder, we still have a life. She'd touch his shoulder when she passed behind him, pretending it was casual. She'd send a text in the middle of the day, something light, something sweet, so the connection wouldn't disappear for hours. When he responded, she felt relief. Not joy. Relief. That scared her. Because relief is what you feel when you've been holding your breath. And Elena was always holding her breath. She became hyper-attentive to his signals. If he laughed once, she replayed it like proof. If he kissed her forehead, she archived it in her body like a survival supply. If he was quiet, she searched for what she had done wrong. She started managing him like an atmosphere. If his mood was heavy, she made herself softer. If he seemed distant, she became more affectionate. If he was stressed, she swallowed her needs so she wouldn't add pressure. She told herself it was love. But real love doesn't feel like emotional labor with no paycheck. Real love doesn't make you earn basic tenderness. She began performing hope. That's what it was. Hope became a routine. A set of rituals designed to keep him close enough to stay. Saturday mornings, she'd suggest coffee together, even if he agreed without looking up. At night, she'd ask small questions, safe questions, so the conversation wouldn't die completely. She'd laugh at jokes that didn't land, just to keep the air light. And the worst part? He let her. He accepted the care like a man accepting a blanket, grateful. But not curious about the person holding it. Sometimes he would say, "You're amazing." And she'd smile. But inside, something would whisper, "If I stopped being amazing, would you still be here?" She began recognizing the imbalance in tiny humiliations. She'd share something vulnerable and he'd respond with a solution. She'd reach for him and he'd offer a quick pat, like reassurance without intimacy. She'd cry quietly in the bathroom, then come out with calm eyes so he wouldn't feel uncomfortable. Loving for two teaches you a painful skill. You learn how to suffer politely. You learn how to grieve without making noise. One night, she caught herself writing a text to him from the next room. Not because he was far away. Because it felt safer than saying it out loud. "I miss you," she typed, then deleted it. Too needy. "I'm proud of us," she typed, then deleted it. Too hopeful. She stared at her phone, realizing she was trying to find the right sentence to unlock someone who had locked himself from the inside. And in that moment, she understood. She wasn't fighting for the relationship anymore. She was fighting for the illusion that she wasn't alone. Because when you're loving for two, it means someone else already stopped loving out loud. And she could feel herself getting tired. Not of him. Of carrying both hearts. 9. The fear of being too much. The fear didn't sound like panic. It sounded like self-control. It sounded like, "Don't say that. Don't ask for more. Don't make it heavy." Elena didn't wake up one day and decide to be less. She simply learned that every honest sentence came with a risk. If she named what she felt, he might go quiet. If she asked for reassurance, he might look tired. If she cried, he might become polite, careful, distant, unreachable. So she started translating herself into something easier. Instead of, "I feel lonely," she said, "Work's been a lot." Instead of, "I miss you," she said, "How was your day?" Instead of, "I need you," she said nothing at all. Because needing him felt like placing a weight on someone who already leaned away. And slowly, a sentence formed in her body, one she never said out loud. What if I'm too much? Too emotional? Too sensitive? Too attached? She began watching herself in real time. She'd feel a wave of sadness rise, then swallow it. She'd want to reach for his hand, then stop halfway. She'd rehearse a conversation in her head, editing out anything that could be labeled dramatic. She wasn't trying to manipulate him. She was trying to survive him. There's a cruel trick emotional unavailability plays on the person who loves it. It makes you believe the problem is your depth. It makes you think love is something you have to downsize. Elena started apologizing for feelings she hadn't even expressed. "Sorry, I'm just tired," she'd say, when really she was grieving. "Sorry, ignore me," she'd whisper, when really she needed comfort. She caught herself smiling at her own pain. turning it into something cute so it wouldn't be inconvenient. And the more she minimized, the more she lost her ability to know what she truly needed. Because when you constantly tell yourself you're too much, you stop trusting your emotions. You start treating your heart like a liability. There was a night she almost spoke. Adrian was sitting on the couch, the TV on low volume, the room dim and quiet. Elena stood in the doorway, holding the truth like a fragile glass. She wanted to say, "I feel like I'm disappearing." She wanted to say, "I'm scared we're becoming strangers." But she saw his posture, relaxed, distant, eyes half on the screen. And her courage collapsed into caution. She sat beside him instead, close enough to touch, far enough to not demand anything. Her throat tightened with words she swallowed so often they began to taste like her life. That's when she understood the real terror. It wasn't that she was too much. It was that she was starting to believe she didn't deserve to be fully felt. Because in a healthy love, your emotions aren't too much. They're information. They're intimacy. They're the bridge. But with Adrian, every time she tried to cross, she felt the air beneath her feet. So she learned to stop mid-step, to hold her breath, to soften her voice, to reduce her presence. Until one night, alone in the bathroom, she looked at her reflection and realized she didn't feel too much. She felt not enough. Not because she lacked value. Because she had been loving in a place that required her to shrink to be tolerated. And that fear stayed with her, quiet and persistent. If I show my whole heart, will he leave? Or worse, will he stay and still not reach for it? The body remembers. Long before her mind admitted anything, her body already knew. The body doesn't argue. It doesn't justify. It simply reacts. Elena started waking up at 3:17 a.m. almost every night. No alarm. No noise. Just a quiet jolt in her chest, like something inside her refused to rest. Adrian slept beside her, steady and undisturbed, his breathing even, his body warm but distant. She would lie there, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why exhaustion felt different now. It wasn't physical. It was emotional fatigue lodged under her ribs. Her shoulders began to tighten during conversations. Her stomach knotted when his tone shifted even slightly. Her heartbeat quickened when she considered bringing up something vulnerable. She told herself she was just stressed. Work had been busy, life was full, adults get tired. But stress usually passes. This stayed. There's a specific ache that comes from not feeling chosen. It settles into your posture. Elena noticed she leaned inward more, subtly angling her body toward him in bed. At dinner, on the couch, as if proximity alone could restore connection. But her muscles were always braced. Always waiting. Waiting for a look. A touch. A signal that she wasn't alone in the room. Her body kept score of every missed moment. The times he didn't notice her silence. The times she reached and he responded late. The times she swallowed tears so gently that even she almost believed they weren't there. She started grinding her teeth at night. The dentist called it anxiety. She called it adaptation. Because her body had learned something her heart didn't want to say. This doesn't feel safe anymore. Not dangerous. Just unsafe. There's a difference. Danger is loud. Unsafety is quiet. It's the way your chest tightens before you speak. The way your hands feel colder when he seems distant. The way you exhale deeply when he finally offers something tender, like your nervous system just received permission to relax. She realized she was living in micro-survival mode. Monitoring his tone. Scanning his mood. Anticipating his distance before it fully arrived. Love isn't supposed to activate your nervous system like a threat. It's supposed to calm it. But her body didn't feel calm. It felt alert. Even during the smallest interactions. One evening, she caught her reflection in the kitchen window. Her face looked composed. But her eyes looked tired in a way makeup couldn't fix. Not tired from effort. Tired from bracing. She placed her hand against her chest and noticed how shallow her breathing had become. like she was rationing oxygen. That's when it hit her. She had been teaching her body to survive a relationship instead of resting inside it. And the body always remembers what the mind tries to minimize. It remembers the nights of silent crying, the hesitation before speaking, the ache of being physically close but emotionally unfelt. Even if she told herself, "It's fine." Even if she told her friends, "We're okay." Her body whispered the truth at 3:17 a.m. This is not peace. This is endurance. And endurance can look like love. Until it begins to wear you down. 11. When hope actually leaves. Hope didn't leave with a goodbye. It left with a quiet click, like a light switch turning off in a room you didn't realize you'd been keeping lit. Elena noticed it on a Thursday morning. Nothing happened. That was the point. Adrian poured coffee like he always did. Keys on the counter, weather on the phone, the same routine, the same calm. He kissed her cheek on the way out, brief, automatic, more habit than hunger. And for the first time, she didn't reach for the meaning. She didn't translate it into love. She didn't tell herself, "He's trying." She just watched it happen the way you watch a train pass when you already know you're not on it. Something inside her had gone still. Not cold. Still. She realized hope had been her loudest emotion for months. Hope that he'd notice her silence. Hope that he'd ask a deeper question. Hope that he'd touch her like he meant it, not like he remembered he should. Hope had kept her moving, planning dinners, softening her voice, forgiving the emptiness. But hope is exhausting when you're the only one carrying it. That morning, she stood by the sink and felt something almost peaceful. Not because things were okay. Because she stopped bargaining. She stopped imagining a future that required him to become someone else. She stopped waiting for the version of Adrian who used to look at her like home. And what replaced hope wasn't rage. It was clarity. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that settles into your bones and makes everything simple. Later that day, he texted, running late. She replied, "Okay." No heart emoji. No, drive safe. No extra softness to make him feel cared for. Just, okay. She stared at the screen, surprised by herself. It wasn't punishment. It was honesty. Because she suddenly couldn't fake warmth that didn't exist in the room. That night, they ate dinner across from each other. He talked about work. She listened. She nodded at the right moments. But she wasn't searching his face anymore. She wasn't scanning for signs. She wasn't trying to pull connection out of the air. She simply heard him. And in that simplicity, she felt a grief she hadn't allowed before. Not the grief of losing him. The grief of realizing she had been alone for a long time. Hope had been the blanket she wrapped around that truth. And now the blanket was gone. She noticed how her body stopped leaning toward him. How she didn't automatically reach for his hand. How silence didn't feel like a personal failure anymore, it felt like an accurate description of what they had become. Adrian looked at her once and said, "You seem quiet." She almost laughed. Because quiet was all she had been doing. But this quiet was different. This quiet wasn't begging. It wasn't performing. It wasn't trying to be understood. It was acceptance. She answered, softly, "Yeah, just tired." He nodded, satisfied with that. And Elena felt the final door inside her close. Not slammed. Closed. The way you close a book when you finally understand the ending. That was the moment hope actually left. Not as heartbreak. As relief. Because without hope, she no longer had to pretend. She no longer had to keep the light on for someone who never walked into the room. And in the strange, tender emptiness that followed, she realized, hope wasn't what had been keeping the relationship alive. Hope was what had been keeping her from facing the truth. 12. The moment she realizes he isn't coming closer. It happened on a night that was supposed to fix things. Not because they had a plan, just because Elena finally ran out of ways to pretend she was fine. They were in the car, parked outside their apartment, engine off, the city's glow spilling faintly through the windshield. Adrian had just finished talking about his day. The same calm summary, The same polished distance. Alina's hands were in her lap, fingers twisting together like they were trying to hold her steady. She said it softly, almost politely. I don't feel close to you anymore. The sentence hung in the air like breath in cold weather. Adrian didn't turn to her right away. He stared forward, blinking slowly, as if she'd asked him something complicated and technical. Then he sighed, small, controlled. What do you mean? He said. And for a second, Elena felt the old hope twitch. The smallest opening. So she stepped toward it. I mean, I miss us, she whispered. I miss when you looked at me like you wanted to know me. She didn't accuse. She didn't raise her voice. She wasn't trying to win. She was trying to be reached. Adrian nodded once, almost thoughtfully. Then he said the line that changed everything. I don't know what you want me to do. Not, I'm sorry. Not, tell me more. Not, I didn't realize. Just, I don't know what you want me to do. It sounded reasonable. But it wasn't a bridge. It was a wall in sentence form. Because she wasn't asking him to do something. She was asking him to feel something. To come closer without being instructed. To notice her without being coached. Elena stared at him, and her chest tightened, not with anger, but with a kind of grief so clean it felt like truth. She realized he was waiting for a checklist. A script. A set of steps that would end the conversation and restore peace. But closeness doesn't come from steps. It comes from desire. And desire can't be negotiated. She tried one last time, voice shaking just enough to reveal what she'd been hiding. I don't want a solution, she said. I want you. I want you to be here with me. Adrian's jaw tensed. He rubbed his thumb against the steering wheel like he was searching for patience. I am here, he replied. The same line again. Technically true. Spiritually empty. That was the moment Elena realized something devastating. He wasn't refusing to come closer. He simply didn't know how. Or worse, he didn't want to. Because people who want closeness move toward it. Even awkwardly. Even imperfectly. They ask questions. They lean in. They stay curious. Adrian stayed composed. He stayed careful. He stayed at the exact same distance. As if closeness was a foreign language he'd decided not to learn. Elena felt herself go quiet. Not to punish him. To protect what was left of her. She looked out the window and watched a couple walk past. Laughing, shoulders touching, unaware of the kind of loneliness that can happen inches from another person. Her throat burned. But she didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, as if agreeing with a truth she'd been avoiding for months. Oh, she said, barely audible. And Adrian, relieved by the quiet, started talking about something else. Just like that. Like her confession had been a minor inconvenience that had passed. And that's when she understood. He wasn't coming closer. Not tomorrow. Not next month. Not after one more conversation. The distance wasn't a phase. It was his home. And if she stayed, she would keep living outside the door, waiting for warmth that wasn't on its way. 13. This isn't love, it's waiting. The sentence didn't arrive like a thought. It arrived like a verdict. This isn't love, it's waiting. Elena heard it in her own head while she was folding laundry, one of Adrian's shirts in her hands. Warm from the dryer, smelling like clean cotton and the life they pretended was still intact. The apartment was quiet, not peaceful. Just unoccupied. Adrian was home, technically. In the other room, the faint glow of a screen painted the wall. She could hear the soft click of a remote. The low murmur of a show he wasn't really watching. And Elena realized she had been living in that, technically, for months. Technically together. Technically fine. Technically not abandoned. But emotionally? She was standing on a platform, checking the horizon for a train that wasn't coming. She thought about all the moments she'd called patience. The nights she stayed gentle when she wanted to scream. The mornings she smiled when her chest felt hollow. The texts she sent just to keep a thread alive. She had named it devotion. But devotion is mutual. This felt like auditioning. She was always preparing. always timing her needs, always choosing the softest version of her truth, hoping it would land without making him retreat, waiting for the right mood, waiting for the right week, waiting for the version of him that used to exist. She wasn't living with Adrian. She was waiting beside him. And the cruelest part was how normal it became. Waiting while he finished a call. Waiting while he decompressed. Waiting while he got through a stressful season. Waiting while he became ready for intimacy. Ready for her. But love doesn't ask you to postpone yourself indefinitely. Love doesn't make you shrink into a placeholder. Love doesn't keep you on hold with the promise of later that never becomes now. Elena walked into the living room and stood in the doorway. Adrian glanced up for half a second. Hey. Hey, she said back, voice calm. He returned to the screen. And she felt something shift, again, but this time it wasn't hope leaving. It was illusion. She saw how the relationship survived, not by connection, but by her willingness to tolerate disconnection. By her ability to act okay. By her talent for making loneliness look like maturity. She remembered a version of herself who used to be loud with joy. Who used to ask questions without rehearsing. Who used to feel safe being emotional. Where did she go? She didn't disappear overnight. She was deferred. One compromise at a time. Elena sat on the edge of the couch, not touching him, not demanding anything. She watched his face, the relaxed concentration, the way his body looked comfortable in a world where she felt like a visitor. And she realized something devastatingly simple. Waiting isn't love. Waiting is hope without evidence. Waiting is you carrying a future alone. Love is movement. Love is presence. Love is someone meeting you halfway without being asked. And Adrian wasn't meeting her. He was letting her approach and approach until she was exhausted. Elena's throat tightened, but her voice stayed quiet. Not dramatic. Just true. I think I've been waiting for you, she said. Adrian paused the show. Finally, he looked at her. What do you mean? He asked, again, like a problem to solve. And Elena understood. Even now, he didn't feel it. He didn't sense the heartbreak under the sentence. He only heard the words. That was the final confirmation. This wasn't love. It was waiting. And she had been calling it loyalty. Because admitting the truth felt like admitting she'd wasted her heart. 14. The quiet confrontation. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No shattered glass. No accusations thrown like weapons across the room. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes when someone has finally stopped trying to be understood and decided to simply tell the truth. They were sitting at the kitchen table. The same table where so many small silences had collected between them. The overhead light cast a soft amber circle around their faces. Almost tender, almost misleading. Elena folded her hands in front of her. Steady. I don't think we're in the same place anymore, she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. Adrian looked at her carefully, as if assessing risk rather than emotion. What are you saying? He asked. And there it was again, that tone. Measured, neutral, slightly inconvenienced. Elena didn't rush. I'm saying I've been asking for closeness, she continued, and you've been offering calm. She let the sentence land. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, not defensive. Exactly, just guarded. I don't understand what you want from me, he replied. She nodded slowly. I know. That was the point. This wasn't about one conversation. It was about a pattern. 1,000 moments where she reached and he remained steady. 1,000 nights where she lay awake beside him, waiting for something unnamed to shift. She didn't accuse him of being cold. She didn't list his failures. She simply described her reality. I feel alone with you, she said softly. The words were fragile, but they didn't break. Adrian's jaw tightened. That's not fair, he answered. Not cruelly, but instinctively. And that's when Elena realized something crucial. He heard criticism. She was offering confession. He heard blame. She was offering vulnerability. He heard a problem. She was offering pain. They were speaking two different emotional languages. And neither of them had a translator. She could feel the old urge rising, the desire to soften it. To reassure him that she didn't mean it that way. To protect him from discomfort. But this time, she didn't. She stayed with the truth. "I'm not attacking you," she said gently. "I'm telling you how it feels." He looked down at the table. Silence stretched between them. Not sharp. Not explosive. Just wide. She watched his face, searching for movement, for a crack, a shift, a sign that he was stepping toward her instead of standing still. But he stayed composed. He stayed careful. He stayed exactly where he had always been. And Elena felt the last illusion dissolve. Because confrontation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the moment you realize that even when you lay your heart on the table, no one reaches for it. She inhaled slowly. Not to steady herself, but to accept what was in front of her. "I don't need you to fix this," she said. "I needed you to feel it." Adrian exhaled, long and controlled. "I don't know how to give you what you're asking for." There it was. Not defiance. Not cruelty. Just limitation. And in that admission, something shifted permanently inside her. Because love can survive conflict. It can survive distance. It can even survive mistakes. But it cannot survive indifference to closeness. The confrontation didn't end with a decision. It ended with clarity. And clarity is quieter than heartbreak. It doesn't scream. It settles. And that night, Elena understood. She had finally said everything. And he had finally revealed that he wasn't coming toward her. Not in anger. Not in apology. Just in stillness. 15 choosing herself without drama. It didn't end with a slammed door. It ended with a decision. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. Elena didn't wake up furious. She woke up clear. There's a difference. Anger burns hot and fast. Clarity settles in your bones. She stood in the kitchen early that morning, sunlight slipping through the blinds, cutting soft lines across the counter. Adrian was still asleep. For the first time in months, her chest didn't feel tight. It felt honest. Not hopeful. Not devastated. Just honest. She poured herself coffee and didn't rehearse a conversation in her head. She didn't plan the perfect wording. She didn't imagine how to protect his feelings while sacrificing her own. She simply accepted something she had resisted for too long. Staying was hurting her more than leaving ever could. And she didn't need a dramatic catalyst to validate that truth. No betrayal. No explosion. No villain. Just a slow erosion of herself. She walked into the bedroom quietly. Adrian stirred as she sat on the edge of the bed. "Hey," he murmured, still half asleep. "Hey," she replied. Her voice wasn't trembling. It wasn't icy either. It was calm in a way that surprised even her. "I think I need to go," she said. He blinked, confused. "Go where?" "From this," she answered softly. Silence filled the room. But it wasn't heavy. It was final. He sat up, trying to process. "You're overreacting," he said gently. And months ago, that sentence would have unraveled her. She would have argued, explained, tried harder to make him understand. But now, she simply shook her head. "No," she said, "I'm done reacting." That was the shift. She wasn't leaving to punish him. She wasn't leaving to scare him into change. She wasn't leaving because she hated him. She was leaving because she loved herself enough to stop disappearing. There was no dramatic speech. No list of grievances. No emotional performance. Just a quiet boundary. "I don't feel close to you," she said, "and I can't keep pretending I do." He looked at her like she was speaking a language he never quite learned. "But we're fine," he insisted. And that word, fine, landed differently now. Fine meant tolerable. Manageable. Survivable. But she didn't want survivable. She wanted alive. She stood up slowly. Her heart was beating fast. But it wasn't panicked. It was awake. Choosing yourself without drama is uncomfortable. Because it denies everyone the story of chaos. There was no villain here. No shattered plates. No tears streaking mascara. Just a woman deciding she would no longer negotiate her own needs. Adrian didn't yell. He didn't beg. He didn't rush toward her. And that, more than anything, confirmed her decision. Because love, when threatened, moves. Even imperfectly. Even clumsily. It reaches. He stayed still. And this time, she didn't interpret that stillness as strength. She interpreted it as distance. She packed a small bag. Not in anger. In acceptance. Every folded shirt felt like a quiet act of self-respect. Every zipped pocket felt like a reclaiming. When she reached the door, she paused. Not to reconsider. To breathe. She turned back once. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said. And she meant it. Because choosing herself wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about finally believing she wasn't asking for too much. The door closed gently behind her. No slam. No echo. Just the sound of someone walking away from endurance and toward peace. 16 Staying no more. Elena didn't feel brave as she walked down the hallway. She felt quiet. Like the part of her that used to beg had finally gone still. The elevator smelled faintly of metal and somebody else's perfume. The numbers lit up one by one. Slow and ordinary, like the world didn't understand what it meant to leave a life you once prayed would change. Outside, the air was cool, clean, too normal for something this final. She sat in her car and didn't turn the key right away. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, and she watched her own reflection in the windshield, eyes tired. But clearer than they'd been in months. There was grief. Of course there was. But underneath it, something steadier had begun to rise. Relief. Not because she wanted to lose him. Because she was done losing herself. People think leaving is a loud moment. But for Elena, it was a series of small permissions. Permission to stop translating silence into love. Permission to stop earning tenderness. Permission to stop calling endurance commitment. She remembered every version of herself she tried to become for him. The softer one. The easier one. The one who didn't need too much. And she realized none of those versions ever brought him closer. They only brought her further from herself. Her phone buzzed once. A text from Adrian. "Where are you?" She stared at the message. Not angry. Not tempted. Just aware. Aware that even now, he was asking for location, not meaning. She typed slowly, "I'm safe. I just can't do this anymore." Then she set the phone face down. No extra explanation. No emotional essay. She had written those essays in her head for months. And none of them changed the distance. This time, she chose something simpler. Truth. She drove to a small overlook outside the city, somewhere the lights looked like scattered gold. She stepped out and let the wind touch her face, as if the world was proving she still belonged to it. For the first time in a long time, she cried, quietly. Not because she was weak. Because she was finally honest. She mourned the future she had carried alone. She mourned the conversations she never got to have. She mourned the girl inside her who thought love meant waiting until someone became ready. And then, in the middle of her tears, she felt it. A strange, gentle freedom. Because staying had been a constant negotiation with her own worth. Leaving was a decision to stop negotiating. Elena wiped her face and whispered, "I'm not staying anymore. Not as revenge. As a vow. A vow to choose relationships where closeness isn't begged for. Where softness isn't punished. Where being human isn't too much." She didn't know what came next. But she knew what wouldn't. No more waiting beside someone who wouldn't come closer. No more shrinking to be tolerated. No more calling loneliness love. And in that quiet night air, she felt the first real beginning she'd had in years. A beginning that didn't depend on someone else changing. Just on her finally coming home to herself. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment, tell me, have you ever stayed too long? Hoping someone would change? And if you want more stories like this, soft, honest, and human, please like this video and subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. We'll meet again in the quiet, where the truth finally has room to breathe.